Chapter 6 of Henry and Ribsy by Beverly Cleary. Ribsy Goes Fishing. "I can't find my tin pants," Mr. Huggins announced Friday evening after supper. "Dad," shouted Henry. When his father got out his tin pants, which were not tin at all, but heavy canvas, Henry knew it meant only one thing. His father was going fishing, salmon fishing. "I get to go too, don't I? Don't I, Dad?" Mr. Huggins grinned at Henry. "Think you can get up at 3 in the morning?" "Sure, I'll get up. Boy, oh boy, I bet I catch a bigger salmon than anybody." "I wouldn't count on it," said Mr. Huggins. "I'm afraid a 20 or 30-pound Chinook would be too much for you to handle." "Oh, I bet I could land one," boasted Henry. After all, if he could lift Robert when they practiced tumbling, a 25-pound fish shouldn't be so heavy. He could see himself having his picture taken with his salmon in one hand and his rod in the other. Well, maybe he couldn't hold up such a big fish with one hand, but he could prop it up in some way. "Henry," Mrs. Huggins looked thoughtfully at her son, "you mustn't be too disappointed if you don't catch anything." "I won't, Mom. I just know I'll catch a salmon." Henry patted his dog, who was dozing in front of the fireplace. "Did you hear that, Ribsy? We're going fishing." "Hey, who said anything about Ribsy?" asked Mr. Huggins. "Aw, Dad, he won't be any trouble," protested Henry. "Would you, fellow?" Ribsy opened one eye and looked at Henry. "If Henry's old enough to go fishing, so is Ribsy," said Mrs. Huggins. Then she smiled and said, "Tomorrow is my vacation. I'll pack your lunches tonight and you can get your own breakfast. I'm going to sleep late and I don't want to have to get up to let Ribsy in and out." "All right, Ribsy goes fishing," agreed Mr. Huggins. "Where are we going?" Henry wanted to know. "I thought we'd try our luck at the mouth of the Umtuka River," answered Henry's father. "That's where Scooter went last week," remarked Henry. "Henry, you better run along to bed if you're going to get up at 3 in the morning," said Mrs. Huggins. "And be sure to wear warm clothes tomorrow. It will be cold over on the coast." For once Henry did not object to going to bed early. Even so, it seemed as if it were still the middle of the night when his father woke him. They could see the stars shining as they ate a hurried breakfast, standing at the draining board. When Ribsy padded into the kitchen to see what was going on, Henry gave him half a can of woofies and some horse meat. The Grumby screen door slammed. "Get your rain hat and coat and let's go." Mr. Huggins picked up 2 lunch boxes from the kitchen table and hurried out the back door. "So you're going with us," said Mr. Grumby when he saw Henry. "Yes, and I bet I catch a salmon," answered Henry. "Better not count on it," said Mr. Grumby, and yawned. He frowned when he saw Ribsy getting into the back seat of the Huggins car with Henry, but he yawned again and did not say anything. As they drove out of the city, Henry listened to his father and Mr. Grumby talk about fish they had caught on other fishing trips. Ribsy could not decide where he wanted to ride. He jumped from the back seat to the front seat. He walked across Mr. Grumby's lap and wagged his tail in his face. When Mr. Grumby did not lower the window for him, Ribsy scrambled into the back seat and bounded from one side of the car to the other, until Henry opened a window so he could lean out and sniff all the interesting smells. Mr. Grumby turned around and frowned at Ribsy. He did not say anything. He just turned up the collar of his mackinaw. "Henry, it's pretty cold for an open window," said Mr. Huggins. "Okay, Dad." Henry pulled Ribsy back into the car by his collar and wound up the window. Ribsy turned around 3 times, curled up on the seat, and went to sleep. Mr. Grumby told about the big one that got away down at the Neelam River. "I bet I do catch a salmon," Henry thought, and using Ribsy for a pillow, he fell asleep himself. Henry did not wake up until the car left the highway and began bouncing along a gravel road near the bridge that bore a sign, Umtuka River. The sky was gray and the air smelled of the sea. "Is it time for lunch?" Henry asked. "Here we are," said Mr. Huggins, "and it's exactly 6 a.m." Henry got out of the car and looked around. In the dim morning light, he could see a shabby building with Sportsman's Cannery painted across the front, a tiny restaurant with steamy windows, a few cabins, and a boathouse with a sign, "Mike's Place, Boats and Tackle." The sound of the breakers and the sight of the rows of boats bobbing in the river below the boathouse filled Henry with excitement. He was really here. He was really going salmon fishing. While Mr. Huggins rented a boat, Ribsy ran in circles, sniffing all the strange new smells. Henry examined the scales hanging from the eaves of the boathouse. He took hold of the hook and pulled down until the hand of the scale spun around and pointed to 25 pounds. "It sure takes a lot of pulling to make 25 pounds, thought Henry. More than anything, he wanted to hang a salmon on that hook and see the hand point to 25 or maybe even 30. He would have his picture taken with the salmon hanging on the scales so everyone would know how much it weighed. "I brought my boy along this time," Mr. Huggins said to Mike, the owner of the boathouse. "Well, hello there, Shorty," said Mike. "So they're going to make a fisherman out of you." "Yes, sir. I hope I catch a salmon," answered Henry. And when he saw Mike smile, he was sorry he had said it. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he couldn't land a salmon, even if one did bite. Still, there wasn't any harm in hoping that he could, was there? "Fishing pretty good?" asked Mr. Huggins. "Pretty good," Mike answered. "Fellow brought in a 36-pounder yesterday." 36 pounds! Oh boy, thought Henry, as he took the lunches and followed his father and Mr. Grumpy down the steps to a boat tied to the float in the river. Ribsy followed Henry into the boat and sniffed at the lunches. "Wind from the south, going to rain," remarked Mr. Grumpy. He wound the rope around the starter and yanked it. The motor sputtered and was silent. Mr. Grumpy rewound the rope. "Hurry," thought Henry. "I want to get started fishing." Mr. Grumpy yanked the rope again. This time the motor started. Henry turned up the collar of his raincoat against the wind and hung on to the side of the boat. The river looked cold and deep. Ribsy stood in the bow and barked excitedly at the seagulls wheeling overhead as their boat joined the other boats scurrying toward the sandbars at the mouth of the river. Although the Umtuka was several hundred feet wide at Mike's Place, it was much narrower where it ran into the ocean because sandbars had formed on either side of the river's mouth. Mr. Grumpy anchored the boat just inside the sandbars, in line with the boats already there. Henry knew this was the best spot to catch the fish as they came out of the ocean and started up the river to spawn. "Golly," said Henry, as he watched the swift current of the river seethe against the breakers. "It looks like the river is fighting to get into the ocean, and the ocean is fighting to get into the river. I wouldn't want to fall in and get carried out there." Mr. Huggins and Mr. Grumpy did not answer. They were too busy getting out the tackle. Mr. Huggins handed Henry a stout rod with a reel attached. The end of the line was fastened to one corner of a three-cornered piece of plastic. A lead sinker was joined to another corner. From the third corner hung a piece of wire and a hook, some red feathers, and a glittering piece of brass. "Henry, I think the easiest way for you to fish is to drop your line overboard and let the current carry it out," said Mr. Huggins. "Like this." He tossed the line into the water. The reel on the rod began to spin as the line was carried out. "But you didn't bait the hook," said Henry. "Salmon that are trying to get up the river to spawn aren't hungry," explained Mr. Huggins. "They bite because the brass spinner makes them angry." "Oh," said Henry. He hoped he could make a salmon good and angry. Then he said, "Ribsy, you get away from those lunches." Henry and the two men settled down to fish in silence. Henry dropped his line overboard, let it be carried out, and slowly reeled it in. His father and Mr. Grumby, skillful fishermen, threw their lines out. Henry dropped his line in again and again. The wind grew colder, and his nose began to run. Toss out the line, reel it in, wipe his nose. Toss out the line, reel it in, wipe his nose. Finally, he said, "Dad, is it lunchtime yet?" Mr. Huggins looked at his watch. "It's exactly 8:36. Toss out the line, reel it in, wipe his nose." Henry tried not to think about how hungry he was. Ribsy sniffed at the lunches and looked hopefully at Henry. A shout went up from another boat, and Henry looked in time to see a man lean out on his boat and hook a great silvery fish through the gills with his gaff and pull it into the boat. "Must be a 20-pounder, remarked Mr. Grumby as the line sang from his reel. Henry was filled with excitement at the sight of the great fish. "Come on, Sam, bite," he thought, and tossed out his line. Large raindrops began to splash the boat. Then the rain came pelting down. Rivulets of water ran off Henry's rain hat. Ribsy shivered and whimpered. Toss out the line, reel it in, wipe his nose. Henry began to wonder if salmon fishing was so much fun after all. If only he was not so hungry. Finally, when the rain stopped, Mr. Huggins said, "What do you say we knock off for a few minutes and have a sandwich?" "Suits me," said Mr. Grumby. "Boy, am I starved." Henry reached for his lunchbox. He poured some soup from his thermos and bit into a thick ham sandwich. Did it taste good. Ribsy watched every bite he took. When Henry swallowed, Ribsy swallowed. Poor Ribsy, he looked so thin with his wet hair plastered against his body. Henry gave him half a sandwich. "Save some for later," warned Mr. Huggins. "We have a long day ahead of us." Ribsy gulped the bread and meat. Then he stood up and shook himself so hard his license tags jingled. Water showered in every direction, spattering faces, soaking sandwiches, splashing into the coffee the men were drinking from their thermos cups. "Hey, cut that out!" Mr. Huggins tried to hold his sandwich out of the spray. Mr. Grumby did not say anything. When Ribsy stopped shaking, he pulled out a handkerchief and mopped his face. Then he poured his coffee into the river, stuffed his sandwich back into his lunchbox, and got out another. "Mr. Grumby sure is fussy," thought Henry, taking a bite out of his soggy sandwich. While Ribsy sat in front of him and watched hungrily, he wagged his tail to show that he would like another bite. His tail slapped against the tackle box. Before Henry could grab it, the box turned over, spilling spinners, hooks, and sinkers into the water in the bottom of the boat. "That sure was close," exclaimed Henry, looking at the tangle of tackle. "Ribsy might have got a fish hook in his tail. That would have been awful." Mr. Grumby cleared his throat. Yes," he said, and began to unsnarl the tackle. "Henry," said Mr. Huggins quietly, "you'd better keep an eye on Ribsy." "I'm sorry, Dad." Henry felt uncomfortable. Of course, Mr. Grumby didn't like Ribsy's overturning the tackle box, but just the same, it would have been awful if Ribsy had got a fish hook in his tail. Henry looked at his wet dog shivering in the wind. "Here, Ribsy, get under my raincoat." He made a place for Ribsy, who managed to turn around 3 times before he curled up on the narrow seat and went to sleep. At least he can't get into trouble when he's asleep, thought Henry, and wolfed a 3rd sandwich and the rest of his soup, a deviled egg, a piece of chocolate cake, and a banana. The warm soup and the rocking of the boat made Henry sleepy. He tossed out his line, reeled it in, wiped his nose over and over again. Why couldn't the fish hurry up and bite? He wished he could go back to the boathouse and stretch his legs, but he didn't like to say so when his father and Mr. Grumby were so interested in fishing. Occasionally a shout went up from one of the other boats, and someone held up a salmon. Rain clouds washed over the forest-covered mountains, along the edge of the sea. To the south, Henry could see another shower approaching. He turned up the collar of his raincoat and waited for the first drops to come spattering down. "What time is it, Dad?" Henry asked. 10 o'clock, answered his father, reeling in his line. "Getting tired?" "No," Henry tried to keep from shivering. "Only 10 o'clock in the morning. It seemed as if they had been there forever. Why, it wasn't even lunchtime. If only he could put his head down someplace just for a few minutes." Suddenly Mr. Grumpy uttered a noise that sounded like whoop. "Got something?" Mr. Huggins' voice was tense as he put down his rod, picked up his gaff. "Yep." Grimly, Mr. Grumpy wound his reel. Henry was no longer sleepy. He dropped his rod and watched eagerly as Mr. Grumpy reeled in his line. He wanted to see exactly how a fish was landed. If a salmon bit for Mr. Grumpy, a salmon might bite for him. Mr. Grumpy stopped winding the reel. The line began to unwind, and Henry knew the salmon was pulling on it. "Is it going to get away?" Henry whispered to his father. He knew he must not disturb Mr. Grumpy. "I don't think so," answered Mr. Huggins. "If the fish puts up a fight, it's best to let him have the line or he'll break it." When Mr. Grumpy began to wind the reel again, Henry watched breathlessly. Suddenly the fish began to fight once more. Mr. Grumpy looked grim as he waited for the salmon to rest. Then he turned the handle of the reel again. The great fish flopped out of the water near the boat. "Get him!" said Mr. Grumpy. Henry watched his father lean out of the boat with the gaff. "Got him," he said, and he hooked the fish through the gills and yanked it into the boat. The enormous fish did not stop fighting. Mr. Huggins tried to club it, but missed, and the flopping salmon slapped against the sleeping Ribsy. Ribsy woke up and saw the strange flopping thing, gave one terrified yelp, and tried to scramble away from it. As he fell over the line and fought desperately to get away, the hook was torn from the salmon's mouth. Mr. Grumpy tried to grab his fish, but it slid through his hands, leaving them covered with scales. Again it slapped against Ribsy, who fell over the lunch boxes in the struggle to get away. With one mighty flop, the fish cleared the side of the boat, landed with a splash that showered Henry and the two men, and swam away. "Kee-yay!" yelped the terrified Ribsy as he fought free of the fishing rods and lunch boxes. With one frantic glance backward, he leaped out the other side of the boat and started swimming upstream. It all happened so fast that Henry and the two men sat with their mouths open. "Well," said Mr. Huggins. Mr. Grumpy did not say a word. He looked at his hands covered with fish scales and stared at the water where his fish had disappeared. "Dad, start the boat!" yelled Henry. "Get Ribsy. He'll be carried out to sea." It seemed to Henry that it took his father forever to pull the anchor and wind the rope around the starter. "Ribsy!" he called frantically to his dog, who was fighting against the swift current of the river, his nose pointed out of the water. "Dad, hurry!" Henry knew that if Ribsy was carried to the breakers, he wouldn't have a chance. Mr. Huggins jerked the rope. The motor sputtered and died. Hurriedly, he rewound the rope. "Dad!" cried Henry in despair. "Ribsy!" The dog was swimming with all his strength, but was slowly being carried backward. A gust of wind blew across the choppy water, and a wave washed over Ribsy's head. Still the boat would not start. "Dad, he can't swim against the current," cried Henry, looking back at the hungry breakers. "Can't you hurry?" Mr. Huggins rewound the rope and yanked. The motor gave a tired gasp. Now Ribsy was being carried back past the boat. "I've got to get him," thought Henry, and he leaned out of the boat. Ribsy was so close he could see the wild look in his eyes, and watched his paws working under the water. Henry leaned a little farther out of the boat, reached toward Ribsy, and lost his balance. As he started to topple into the water, he felt a hand grab him by the collar of his raincoat and yank him back into the boat. "Don't lean out," said Mr. Huggins sharply, and rewound the rope. Henry knew there was no reason now to lean out of the boat. The current had swept Ribsy far beyond his reach. By this time, the fishermen in the other boats were watching. "Don't worry, Sonny," called one of the men. He pulled up his anchor and started his powerful motor and headed toward Ribsy. More terrified than ever by the roar of the motor, Ribsy struggled to get away from the boat bearing down on him. Henry was almost afraid to look. What if the man couldn't catch Ribsy? What if the boat ran over him? The man steered the boat close to Ribsy, reached out with his gaff, hooked it through Ribsy's collar, and lifted the struggling, dripping dog into his boat. The other fishermen began to laugh. "Must be a 30-pounder you just landed," someone called. Henry was limp with relief. Let them laugh. Ribsy was safe. He wasn't going to be carried into those angry breakers, and that was all that mattered. The man swung his boat around in a wider circle and pulled up close to the Huggins boat. He handed the soggy dog across to Henry. "Gee, thanks," Henry managed to say as he clutched the shivering Ribsy. "Don't mention it," answered the man. His big boat roared away, leaving the smaller boat bobbing in his wake. "Gee," Henry hugged his dog. Ribsy licked his face with his long pink tongue. "Gee, that sure was close." "It sure was," agreed Mr. Huggins. An uncomfortable silence fell on all three. "Sorry about the salmon, Mr. Grumby," added Mr. Huggins. "Must have been a 25-pounder," said Mr. Grumby regretfully. Henry didn't want to look at Mr. Grumby. "I'm sorry, too," he said, as he ran his hand along Ribsy's tail to wipe off some of the water. "I guess Ribsy had never seen a salmon before, and it scared him. I know he didn't mean to make you lose it." "Henry, how would you like to take Ribsy to the boathouse to dry out?" asked his father. "Good idea," said Mr. Grumby. "Okay, Dad," agreed Henry, because he wanted to get his dog warm and dry again. But from the way Mr. Grumby spoke, he knew he would have to stay there the rest of the day, and his chance of catching a salmon was gone. Henry looked sadly at his dog. Ribsy stood up and shook himself until his license tags jingled.